It's my pleasure now to introduce Kathy Willis as our keynote speaker for this afternoon. Kathy Willis is a professor of biodiversity at the Oxford's Department of Zoology. She's also the Oxford Martin Senior Fellow at the Oxford Martin School. And since 2013, she's been leading the research at the Kew Science Center at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew. So welcome, Kathy Willis. Thank you.
So thank you very much for having me here. That was a very interesting discussion before, and actually I will lead on from some of those points that were raised. So the question that I wanted to really address this morning was something which sort of, yes, it underpins a lot of this discussion about CSR, all these other things that are going on, and it's in the natural capital framework. And does a natural capital approach address the mutuality of biodiversity and business? So I just want to start with this one, because in 2010, I was appointed to the Tasso Leventis Chair in Biodiversity, and I was very excited by that, moved to the Department of Zoology. That week, the UK had a big survey on the word biodiversity, and 80% of the UK population thought it was a washing powder, at which point I realised my work was well and truly cut out. However, at the same time, and of course it isn't. I mean, of course it's species, it's populations, it's communities, and it's even genetic diversity, all those incredibly important elements that underpin life on Earth. But the interesting thing, that same year, McKinsey held a report and asked about over 1,500 surveys from businesses if biodiversity was important to their business. And although 32% said not at all, the rest went from fairly important to extremely important. And why did they say that? Well, corporate social responsibility was one of them, and this is still very much part of the whole ethos and the value chains of many businesses. And I took this one off the web yesterday, the United Motors Group, very nice indication, someone holding a plant. You immediately get the understanding of what this is about. The other one is slightly more worrying in the sense that it's to do with risk. It's to do with corporate risk if you get it wrong. And I mean, immediately I put BP in that image up, people laughed. But sure enough, absolutely. The Deepwater Horizon, the whole thing about Deepwater Horizon and the things that follow from it show the damage that can happen if you really don't put some idea behind or some thoughts behind that value chain. But the third group was actually very much along the lines of thinking about ecosystem services and natural capital. And this all really started out in 2005, and this whole idea about making nature's value visible. And the TEEB reports in particular, the economics of biodiversity, were all in there. And people are buying into these ideas that actually biodiversity has a value, that we have a value, it has a value for businesses. And if you get that value, if you appreciate that, then you also bring the value back into the business. So when I came across this, and I was asked to talk at this, I have to admit, first of all, I wasn't quite sure what economics of mutuality meant. And so I went and got Bruno's book and read this. And the more I read it, actually, the more interested I became in it, because I think it is a different way of thinking about biodiversity and business. However, I started off, as we all do, thinking, right, okay, what do we mean by mutual at this point? And went to the Oxford English Dictionary, to have in common, and actions that are for the benefit of both. So let me go back to that question then. Does that natural capital approach, the TEEB approach, all of this putting a value on nature, does it address the mutuality of biodiversity and business? So what are we talking about when we think about natural capital? So the way that a number of us are thinking, or the way that is to put it into the compartments of what you need to know when you are measuring natural capital. Well, first of all, you need to know what are your assets? What are your natural capital assets, which could be your species, your communities, your landscapes, ecosystem, soils, water, air, etc. But that's only part of the equation. There's no good mapping the biodiversity if you then don't understand the ecosystem services provided by those assets. So these are things like pollination, biomass, carbon drawdown, erosion protection, etc. But then none of those are under that natural capital framing unless they have a societal outcome, a benefit for business, a benefit for society at large. So, for example, food, energy, equitable climates through carbon drawdown, etc. So, does this approach then underpin, is it good for biodiversity and business? Most of us, when we're mapping natural capital assets, will go this way. And I think when we're going from the input through to the output, it more often than not has a benefit for business. So let me give you a classic example, many of you might know this, which is to do with the water that goes into New York City. So the water that goes into New York City, it's filtrated and the runoff comes through two major catchments, the Croton and the Catskill Mountains. And the trees and the biodiverse landscape there are really important at cleaning that water. But it is a beautiful landscape. So, of course, people also want to live there, and there was increasing urbanization, and the water became more and more turbid, with more and more overland flow occurring. So the New York City's water supply organization went back and looked at is it cheaper to basically conserve this or to build a water filtration plant? And what they found was the following, that if you build a water filtration plant, it was going to cost $2 to $6 billion, and then it cost around $300 million a year to run. In comparison, if they repossessed a lot of those beautiful forests, then that alone was about 1 to 1.5 billion to protect. And that's indeed what they did. And if you go to any of those areas now, you will see these boards up in the forest saying, this is protecting the clean water for New York City. So it works going that way more often than not. It's good for biodiversity and it's good for business. But the problems come, I think, when you focus on the outputs. So if you start at this end and say, okay, we want clean water or we want carbon sequestration, I think that's when you start to lose mutuality. So you're going in that direction. That's what many people want to do. What biodiversity do we need in order to draw down carbon? That would be your sort of question. So let's look at this one, rainforest in Brazil. So it's high biodiversity, high biomass accumulation, and excellent in carbon CO2 sequestration. So ticks all those boxes. However, you also have this, which is Brazilian eucalyptus plantation. Eucalyptus is not native to Brazil. High biomass accumulation, exotic monodominant forest, very, very low biodiversity, but it ticks your carbon sequestration box. So you don't have mutuality in there. You've lost it because you focused on the outcomes rather than the input. So what do we need then to ensure that you do tick both of these boxes? And I think there's three things that I'm just now going to focus on in the remaining 8 minutes. First of all, an understanding of the inputs. Secondly, the use of innovative technologies. And third, mutuality in the marketplace. And the third one is what I'm most nervous about talking about in front of a group of economists and businesses. However, I'll have a go. Okay, so let's go with the inputs first of all. So I really like this diagram from Bruno's book about the input analysis of a sachet of Colombian coffee. So for a single sachet of Colombian coffee, what they looked at, these are your natural capital inputs, i.e. the resources used. This was the amount per sachet, and this is the percentage of the highest metric, the highest amount that's being used in which part of the process. And what comes through from this, when you look at the process from agriculture to the end of life, your highest amount of input of natural capital is actually in the agriculture, in the packaging, so particularly within packaging, and I thought it's a really interesting one, that a lot of abiotic resources used in the packaging, and then in the use, a lot of water. So therefore, the point being made, these are the areas, the sort of hotspots that you need to concentrate on to reduce the impact on the business and to improve the outcome for biodiversity. Really interesting. And the question I then wanted to say, well, within a natural capital framework, what inputs do we need to be considering? There's clearly that input, which is taking it from agriculture through to the end of life for the use by the consumer. So that's your knowledge on inputs, and your framing in there. What you're trying to do is reduce your inputs. But you have another set to think about, which is your inputs on natural capital important to get maximum quality and yield in the field. And that is about how to enhance them rather than reduce them. So I'm going to carry on the coffee theme, given you've all had coffee as well this morning. So you've got your coffee plant, your seedling, that's your first thing you need to think about when you're in the field. But then you need to think about your pollination. It's a crop that requires pollination services. You then need to think about your water and light, and that as a result of all of that, that can directly influence your yield and quality. So where are your input points in here? Well, the first one is in actually foraging habitats and biodiversity foraging habitats, and the other one is in terms of your shade, water and light. So let me give you two examples then when you're taking this input metric. So the first one is forest patches within an agricultural landscape. So these things here, you look at them and you think, especially if you've got big machinery, they're the first things that people want to effectively cut away. They're a real nuisance to a big farming family. However, when they looked at distance away from those forest patches and what it did to the coffee, the further away you got from those pollination services, the more misformed beans you got, those pea-berry beans, the ones at the bottom here. And so what they found was that patch of forest, which is really important for foraging, actually improved coffee yields by 20% and quality by 27%. And on one single farmer, that resulted in around $60,000 a year. So immediately you can see mutuality in both the business and biodiversity. And let me just give you a second one, which is about shade trees in coffee plantations. It's well known that coffee trees need shade, and this is a really important, it's been long recognised. But what sort of shade are we talking about? And this is a very nice study where this is in India, where they looked at the difference between your native trees in here, biodiversity-rich forest, and here's your coffee underneath, and this, which is Grevilla robusta, which is an exotic tree from Australia, fast-growing, also provides shade. What they found was that when you had the exotic tree, you got greater pre-monsoon berry loss, more berries got lost through the process of heavy rains. You also had greater water and temperature stress because those exotic trees were competing for the water and the shade. And these two factors had a huge impact on the quality of the beans. So you got a much higher quality of bean when you focused on the input, and the input metric being the biodiversity. Okay, so let me now move on to innovative technologies. And so if we're needing technologies to measure these, given how much everyone always focusing now in businesses on technologies, and I was very taken with the comment earlier about, you need to really be looking at the cutting edge technologies. Well, unfortunately, I would say, and being a biologist myself, at this criticism comes to me, there's still far too much of this going on. We're still at the clipboard stage for most of this measurement. And we really, really need to move away from this if everyone is to accept and start to take this biodiversity thinking into a place where it's also measured alongside businesses. And it's not that we don't have these things, it's just that the use of embracing things like AI and big data is really important. And we have global data sets that are currently woefully underutilized. This is one of them, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, something very few people really know about, yet it has 740 million species occurrence records in it. What does that look like? That's what it looks like. So it's not we don't have the data, but it's that next bit of taking technologies to actually join these together. And with the right data and modelling approaches, it is possible to very quickly calculate on the fly, remotely, different services. Let me just give very quickly pollination services. So what you need to know which crops require pollination services, really obvious, but something many people often forget in the process. You need to know the availability of potential pollinators, and you need to know the availability of foraging habitats. From that, you can build a model. I've got a very simple one up here, and I'm not going to go through it, but you can just see it's very much a systems model. And as a result of that, you can come up with, so this is Tenerife. It's good to do it on an island, things don't fly off too quickly. Here's your potential nesting habitat. Here are your crops that require them. Therefore, this area is no use because many of these pollinators only fly 1.5 kilometres. So in fact, the most important services for pollination is round the edge. And so therefore, when you're thinking about pollination services, that's the biodiversity you need to conserve. And you can do this, we've done this for the whole of Europe. And you can see very big difference. Denmark, most of Denmark's got very good pollination services. Most of southern Norway hasn't. It's cold and it's basically not good for insect pollination. Finally then, mutuality in the business place, and I've got 1 minute left, so this is, I can skate over this quickly, no one can get at me. Okay, so once you've done that, where is that marketplace then? Where is it that your landowner and your business can really properly start to trade? And so you can use this system in here where you start to do this remote joining up. Oh, crikey, that's okay. And you can draw around your area, and you can very quickly work out nowadays, using these technologies, what are your main ecosystem services across that landscape. But that doesn't provide you with the marketplace. And right now we seem to spend huge amounts of time looking at the benefits and calculating for beneficiaries. But actually, at the end of the day, the landowner and the opportunity cost that landowner could get for alternative uses is in many ways probably a quickest and easiest way of doing this. And the system we've been looking at, and it's just a system, is exactly that. So your landowner can upload his land with the full details of the pollination services, and he puts a cost on it, a cost based on the opportunity cost if he converted it to something else, let's say corn or oil palm. You then have a trading platform, similar to eBay, where you have the people who require those ecosystem services to come in and be able to bid against that price up there. And that could be your farmer, your water bottling factory, or even your carbon dioxide emitting company that wants basically carbon sequestration. Right, so that's just an example of doing it. Let me just summarise then. So I think natural capital and that framing can sometimes result in mutuality, but not always, and we have to be really careful about this one. We need to focus on the inputs and not the outputs, and there are two types of inputs to consider. One that promotes the reduction in natural capital use, which goes from the agriculture to the end use, and the other one, which is promoting the enhancement of those inputs. I think we absolutely urgently need to embrace new technologies, and that is a sort of call to any biologist or anybody that's actually taking this data. We need to be moving beyond the clipboard, and we need to create a marketplace where this stuff really can be traded, and there is a proper market price that's based on those local scale differences that we all know so well. And maybe it's these online trading platforms, it's similar to eBay and other things like Gumtree. Maybe that is the way forward to start to think about how you can have mutuality where both your landowner and the person who wants to buy it actually can both benefit from this trading. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Willis. It's now my pleasure to introduce two MBA students who will be giving a response. The first is Eamon Devlin, and the second is Olya Krestyaninova. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Professor Willis. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And thank you so much for this introduction on natural capital and how it ties to biodiversity and mutuality with the business. So we've all experienced natural capital because it underpins the economic value that it creates for us, whether it's direct or indirect. We all experience it because we're all waiting for the benefit that natural capital produced for us in just about 10 minutes when we have our lunch. And I'm sorry, I'm the limiting factor at the moment. But we need to understand that natural capital or natural services that it provides actually equates to maybe 2 to 3% of our economic growth and economic output. It might sound like a small number, but actually on the macroeconomic scale, it's not. So how do we value? How do we add a number to it? And more importantly, how do we account for natural capital that's out there? We've discussed measurements and different frameworks, and that's something that we're working towards. And also businesses are talking about integrating accounting systems. So how do we take something that's an externality or a stranded asset and turn it into an asset that goes onto the balance sheet and actually increases the overall bottom line? This will require us a change in stocks and flows in order to mitigate the discrepancies between shareholders and stakeholders. But we need to consider first the these natural capitals are finite. Some of them are irreplaceable. And more importantly, who owns them? And at the same time, they might not be unique. As in a sense, when we take a plot of land, it might be used for recreation. Similarly, it could be used for a coffee plantation, or it could be used to create a forest that will spur 20, 30 years down the line. And lastly, we do need the natural capital for economic activities. It's absolutely necessary. But it's not only the outputs, and it's something that Kathy kept mentioning. We can't only look at the outputs, but also the inputs, but also how it keeps regenerating. So how is the natural capital recycled and integrated back into the system? So this is where the conversation of mutuality comes in. And mutuality in the sense of businesses and biodiversity working together. And at the same time, it's not only businesses, but also the way we govern those natural capitals. So first, we've talked about the scales or between the inputs and outputs. So sure, let's consider what goes into our businesses and how we use them. But what are the outputs? And the outputs are not only the bottom lines, but also what kind of outputs are social and economic benefits it has. And we also need to look at the entire supply chain in order to have the best sort of outputs. Then we have to look at the innovation, and Kathy has also mentioned that we need to look at technologies and work with them, especially as we enter the fourth industrial revolution. And it requires data collection, but also utilizing that data in order to benefit both. And lastly, which is probably the toughest one, is what kind of marketplace are we creating? So is it a marketplace that only creates an account for these biodiversities, or do we, apart from finding the value for it, do we also find the replacement value for it? So what if we lose the forest? What will be the cost, not only to our enjoyment, but also to the growth of our business, to the growth of our families and next generations? Or do we have to think of marketplaces that are a little bit more complex and a little bit more systematic?
Hello, everyone. Is that on? Can everyone hear me in the back? Awesome. Cool. So my name is Eamon Devlin. I'm going to actually put on a bit more of an ecologist, biologist hat. As just a couple years ago, I was sitting in my biodiversity and social policy class, and we were having a very similar debate to what we're having right now. So I'm going to play devil's advocate to a lot of things that were said and kind of highlight some ethical issues. So one of the first things that our professor at that class posed a question of was, now, if we value a species and we say the value is, let's say, 1 million per year, and we have an opportunity to eliminate the species, and it's a business opportunity of 2 million per year, how many people are comfortable doing that, putting a species to extinction? Yeah, no one's hands go up in here, and no one's hands went up in the biology class. So that's an ethical concern, right? As soon as you put a valuation on something and you can compare things apples to apples, you have to be ready for the consequences of what happens when something doesn't come out in the way that you'd like it to. Now, this also leads to a potential of what we called holding nature hostage, in that if you have a marketplace for, let's say, a plot of land, and I'm saying, you can buy this land or these ecosystem services for me, or I'm going to turn it into a building. Does that sound like a great proposition to many people? Probably not. You have to be careful of how we build these marketplaces so that there's a way in which we're not having these drastic trade-offs where you can essentially hold nature hostage. I remember that my professor put up a picture, and it was someone holding a chainsaw next to a tree with a little sign saying, how much is this tree worth to you? Now, that's a hyperbole, obviously, but it gets the point across. So if we take this further, and I'm going to channel my inner Richard Barker, because if there's one thing I learned from accounting, it's that if we consider something an asset, we need two things. We need to know that it has future value, it's going to generate future benefit, and two, that we have control of it. So I think we've been able to demonstrate that natural capital will generate a future value, but now we have the question of who has it, who has control over it. Now, if we look at that and we say a corporation, to be able to value it, must have control over it, we have to ask ourselves, do they own all the biota and everything that is on that land surface to be able to extract the ecosystem services from that plot of land? I think most of us, when we go and we would look in our backyard, we might say we own the trees, we might say we own the garden that's in there, but how many people say they own the rabbits? How many people say that the birds chirping outside their window are theirs? Not many. And some people may make a business over bringing bees to pollinate crops, but if you start supplying that yourselves, do you own those bees that are on the land? What I think this really gets into is the crux of mutuality, and that if businesses are going to provide a space and a way to let these organisms in this biota live and even integrate them into their business in exchange for getting ecosystem services back, we need to find a balance in which businesses and biota and natural capital are being mutual, that you're having a mutual symbiotic relationship, if I can go back to my ecological roots. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed for those excellent presentations and responses. I just want to take the last few minutes with Bruno to synthesize some of the points that have emerged during the course of this morning. And let me start with the point at which I started the forum early this morning, with the observation that the current model of the firm puts financial capital, profit at the heart. And we heard in the panel the importance in terms of at least thinking in terms of a long-term objective, and that may help to enhance the performance of companies. We also heard of the idea that if you embrace other stakeholders in the firm, that too may be beneficial for the success and profitability of companies. But there is a notion that, well, one might go too far, that some of this might be at the expense of profitability and essentially become impact investing, or require philanthropy and generate no profit at all. Well, that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about thinking of the purpose of the company as the central driving force in terms of the role of business in promoting our interests as customers, consumers, and societies. Because the traditional view that puts profit at the center, even if it's long-term and enlightened shareholder approach, still lacks authenticity. It's only when you have a purpose that reflects broader interests that notion becomes a credible one. And in doing that, what one is saying is that the purpose of business is not to produce profits. The purpose of business is to produce goods and services that benefit us as customers and communities. And in the process of doing that, business produces profits, but profits are not per se the purpose of business. And what a company is an organization that creates a commitment to a common purpose. And in committing to that common purpose, what it does is it commits to those people who contribute to that common purpose. And they, in turn, then respond by committing to the creation of that common purpose, contributing to it. And that, therefore, gives rise to a reciprocal relationship of trust. It's why this approach addresses that deficit of trust that I started the presentation with this morning. And in so doing, what one is demonstrating is the reason why this is mutually beneficial is that it creates more loyal customers, more engaged employees, more reliable suppliers, more connected investors and lower cost of capital, and that drives more successful business. And in the master classes, we heard how to do that in terms of the notions of purpose, partnerships, problems, plans, practices, performance, profits. And underlying those are the notions that the purpose of business is to promote the interests of us as customers and communities. That the partnerships involve creating partnerships across the ecosystem. That the problems that are addressed are the pain points of people in those ecosystems. That the plans involve creating metrics of how one can address those problems. That the practices involve making investments in addressing those problems and pain points in the system. And that the performance is in terms of measuring the impact, in terms of creating natural, human, and social capital. And at the end of that comes the profits that can then be distributed and incentivize people. And what is remarkable about thinking about it in this way is that it then leads one to realize that what business is about is producing solutions to the problems of people and planet profitably. Producing profitable solutions to the problems of people and planet. And that notion of business as being a mechanism of solving problems of people and planet profitably creates a much more insightful and much more exciting view of what business is about than just thinking about business as being accounting, finance, human resource management, marketing, operations management, organizational structures, and strategy. It says that what business is really about is mobilizing all of the forces of human capital, social capital, financial capital, natural capital, and using technology as best we can and the advances in technology to provide those solutions for people and planet profitably. So if there's one message that I'd like you to take away from this morning, it's the notion that what this is attempting to do is to give us the instruments to address the problems of people and planet profitably.
Well, business existed before financial capitalism. It will exist after financial capitalism. Business is part of the DNA of people. We've done business since we were a human species. In a sense, over the last 50 years, business lost its way just by focusing on one aspect of value creation, which is financial capital. But it is an anomaly that we can actually correct. And the whole purpose of what I'm trying to share with you during these 2 days is that in order for business to be an actor of goodness in society, it has to stay true to its nature. And business is about delivering performance. It's about measuring performance. It's about addressing people and planet problems profitably. This is the nature of business. And you remember that we started our session by saying that the question that started the whole endeavor, that what should be the right level of profits? And 10 years later, we screwed up so many times. You don't want to know about it. But I think we have developed a process, a methodology that can actually answer this question. And that question is very contextual. It's not the same for a car company or for a garment company or for a bank. It is very contextual. But we have developed actually a process to start answering that question. And it gives me great hope that it's not only a management theory, it's not only just a bench of case studies. It's really happening as we speak. And we are at the moment doing a series of case studies within the Mars ecosystem. We're also starting a set of case studies in the Mulliez retail group ecosystem, one of the largest retail groups. And we think actually it's our conviction that if we bring alignment between the management account, which is what we call the financial P&L, with the purpose of that company, not only we are going to restore the purpose of business, which is about addressing people and planet issues profitably, but we are going to transform our business as a scalable force for good. And in spirit of mutuality, I give you back 25 seconds to your lunch. Thank you. Thank you.